Well, the scheme that started on the 1st of April is called the Equity Loan Scheme under Help to Buy. And in essence, what happens is a home buyer comes along to buy a new home. It's only available for new homes. And they have a 5% deposit. The government puts in 20%, and in the first 5 years there's no interest to pay on that. And then they go out and borrow 75%, the rest of the purchase price, from one of the high street lenders. And it addresses two problems, really. It addresses what we call the deposit gap, because since the downturn in 2008, first-time buyers have required very large deposits, 20-25%. So it gets around that problem because they only need a 5% deposit. And also there's an affordability issue. Because we're only having to borrow 75%, it's much more affordable in terms of monthly payments than if you had to go and borrow 95%. And of course the great benefit of the scheme is it's focused on new build, so it's helping to get house building up, which helps to generate jobs and economic activity. So it's firing on a lot of cylinders.
Is this kickstarting the building industry and the housing market, do you think?
It is already, and in fact it's quite remarkable, even though it only came in on the 1st of April. We've only got figures, we only have quarterly house building numbers in this country, but for the second quarter we've already seen a significant upturn in house building, and in the first half of the year we've seen private house building starts up 22%, which is a big increase. And I suspect that once we get the figures for the second half of this year, there'll be even more significant increase.
Yeah. From the 1st of January, there's also a new scheme. Can you explain me what that is?
Yes, well, unhelpfully, it's called Help to Buy. So we've got two very different schemes, which both have the same name, and it causes endless confusion. The new scheme that comes in on the 1st of January will apply across the whole of the United Kingdom, whereas the scheme that we have at the moment is only in England. And it'll apply to new and second hand. So it's a much, much bigger scheme. It's on a much bigger scale. And what happens there is the purchaser has a 5% deposit and they borrow 95%. So from their perspective, it's just a 95% mortgage. And those have been very scarce in the last 5 or 6 years. And behind the scenes, if you like, the government is going to indemnify the lenders against a proportion of their potential losses. So if somebody ends up being repossessed and the lender makes a loss, the government will cover some of that. So what that's introducing is loans in the 80 to 95% loan to value range.
This scheme has a market impact, as you described. There's an increased supply. It's easier for people to get on the housing ladder. I would say it's good from your point of view, but are there also any risks involved, do you think?
Well, there's a lot of concern, not about the equity loan scheme that's helping new build. I've not heard anyone really express any reservations about that one. In fact, quite the opposite. People are very positive about it because, of course, it's helping to kickstart new build, which is good for the economy, and also we have a housing supply crisis in this country going back 20 years. So no one seems to have any criticism of that scheme. The other scheme has, though, elicited a lot of criticism, particularly from economists, and the concern is that because it's on such a scale, it'll give a big boost to demand. There won't be a compensating increase in supply, and therefore it might create a surge in house prices. And there's been talk about a price bubble and so on. Now our focus is on the new build sector, and of course the equity loan scheme is the important one for us. But it has to be said that the other scheme has raised quite a lot of concern.
Yeah, but because we already see house prices rising in this country now, more quicker than previous years.
Yes, we are, and it's curious because of course the scheme hasn't even, the big scheme hasn't even started yet. It doesn't come until the 1st of January. One suspects there's a degree of anticipation. Some people are thinking, well, prices are going to go up, so perhaps I should buy now. I think there's a bit of hysteria in all of this. It's a very curious situation. We had a very sharp downturn in the housing market in 2007 and 8 and into 2009. And since then, the market's been fairly flat. We've seen very little recovery. Prices have moved around, but really nothing much. And then as soon as you see a little bit of recovery, everyone starts panicking and saying, oh, we've got a house price bubble, this is terrible. But I think it's being exaggerated. There were some figures coming out from the government a little while ago, and they showed prices were up, I think it was about 3.5%. But once you took London out of that and the really strong markets of the southeast, prices across the rest of England were up 1%. Well, you know, we shouldn't be getting too upset about that.
But even when it's not a bubble which is being created, despite the crisis from 2008, house prices in the UK have still been historically high at this point.
Yes, yes.
So any increase is for people, especially with lower incomes, is tough.
It is a concern, yes. Prices in relation to earnings or incomes are very high in this country, even now, even after the downturn that we've seen. And that reflects the shortage of supply in this country that goes back, you know, it's a legacy going back 20 years. So you're right that we don't really want to see prices going up, but of course it's a market. There's nothing much any of us can do about that. Prices are starting to go up because we've seen an increase in demand. But that's not just because of the schemes. We had begun to see some improvement in the UK housing market going back in the first quarter of this year, even before the schemes were announced. We have another scheme in this country called the Funding for Lending Scheme, and that gives access to very cheap credit to the banks. So the banks are able to lend at very, very competitive mortgage rates, which means that mortgages are, if you can overcome the deposit gap, a mortgage is really very cheap at the moment. And we are already seeing signs of life in the housing market even in the first quarter, but of course the equity loan scheme has given that a further boost, and then presumably from January next year we'll see another boost.
It's a vibrant combination, all these factors.
Yes, it is a combination, yes, very much so.
Yeah, so your remedy, I suspect you would say, is build more houses if you talk about house prices getting too high.
Well, it is. Of course, we couldn't build enough houses. Both schemes are for 3 years. We couldn't build enough houses in 3 years to prevent a bubble if that did begin to emerge. I think the important thing about that from our perspective is that we don't want to see a price bubble. That doesn't help house builders, because the trouble with price bubbles is they tend to burst and then you've got all the problems at the other end. We'd rather see a fairly stable situation. So what we hope will happen is if prices do begin to move ahead a bit too quickly, that the Treasury, who are behind the scheme, and the Bank of England, who are the regulatory authorities for interest rates and so on, will get together and figure out a way that we can perhaps make sure that doesn't happen. I think it's up to them. It's clearly not up to us. We need a sustained increase in house building over 15, 20 years, not 2 or 3 years, to solve our fundamental housing crisis.
You could have also said, why don't we stick with just the equity loan scheme and not with the other scheme that's going to kick on the 1st of January?
Well, that would be one way, and there have been people who have said we shouldn't go ahead with the mortgage guarantee scheme, but that's a decision for the Chancellor and for the government. That's not really for us to say. Our focus, as I say, is on new build, and the equity loan scheme is having a very positive effect on new build, and that's great. It's great for the house builders, but it's also good for the country, because we're finally beginning to see an upturn in house building. That's generating economic activity and jobs, and it's just beginning to make a small inroad into the undersupply problem that we've had for 20 years. It'll be a long time solving it, but at least we're starting to make progress.